we're beginning this week the Sefer Orot HaTorah in earnest, and I would highly recommend that it's, even if your Hebrew is not great, if you're following along at home, or if you're attending the Shiur in person, it's really not a bad idea. It's a few shekel, I think it's like 30 shekel. You get 5 books in one, all things that hopefully over the years we'll be able to study with Rav Kook for many years to come. And the Sefer Orot HaTeshuva begins with a little bit of a hakdama, a little bit of an introduction, which is amazing because it's almost as if you ever have those friends where you have a conversation with them and you haven't spoken to them for, a good several months, sometimes even years, and you bump into them and you just pick up with whatever the last conversation was. So Rav Kook here, like a good friend, picks up almost like on the exact same trend of thought that he was talking about 14 years earlier in the letter that we ended off with last time. And now it's 14 years later, and the Sefer is being published. Now I'll remind everybody that the first 3 chapters of the Sefer Orot HaTeshuva are a standalone work that Rav Kook calls the 𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗟, the Teshuva letter. And the following chapters that we have really are the hard work of his Talmidim and his son, Rav 𝗦𝗢𝗗𝗜𝗔𝗟, who basically just went through all of, how many unpublished pieces of paper there are, all rabbis have their pockets filled with papers and their pens and sticky notes, in their pockets. But Rav Kook was just a 𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗟, a never-ending stream. And there are thousands and thousands of little notebooks of Rav Kook's chidushim on everything. They're still putting out Rav Kook's chidushim on Shas, on the agaritas of Shas. We only have a few small volumes, but they're still putting out. And so the rest of the Sefer is really just his students and his son going through and kind of putting together the pieces and creating this amazing, beautiful tapestry, this blanket of tshuva that we could wrap ourselves in. So this we do have from Rav Kook's pen. This is the introduction to the 𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗟, and serves as kind of an introduction to the entire Sefer Orot HaTeshuva, which I'd like to begin this evening. And we'll go slowly. The whole thing that we're going to be reading tonight is just this one small page, this one small paragraph. But as usual, Rav Kook's language is so rich and is so beautiful, and he's touching on so many different things. So we'll just go slowly and we'll enjoy ourselves. So Rav Kook writes, "Ze kama ani nilcham milchama pnimis." It's been now for some time, we know 14 years, that I've been fighting this inner war, this inner battle. In some of the commentaries on Orot HaTeshuva, Rav Aviner has a beautiful commentary on Orot HaTeshuva. Some other Talmidim of Rav 𝗦𝗢𝗗𝗜𝗔𝗟 have beautiful commentaries on Orot HaTeshuva. So in one of the commentaries, I believe it's in Rav Aviner's, he quotes from Rav Kook in a different place, where Rav Kook says, sometimes a person feels that they're writing because they have the strength to write, or they feel like they get up to say something because they feel like they have the strength to say something, Like, I'm a person who could say something and therefore should say something, and I'm going to get up and say it. So Rav Kook writes in one place, specifically talking about writing about tshuva and writing about these kind of loftier, more umbrella, hot-button issues in Yiddishkeit. So Rav Kook writes, I'm not writing and I'm not speaking, I'm not going on this tour. Rav Kook literally went all around Eretz Yisrael on a tshuva tour, like Yishai Ribo in Caesarea, Yishai Ribo here, and like Kol HaKavod, and he's also on a tshuva tour. Avraham Fried on his tshuva tour with Aviv Geffen. But Rav Kook went on a tshuva tour. He went to all the moshavim and he went to all the kibbutzim. And he said, the reason I'm doing this is not because I have the strength to speak. He said it's because I don't have the strength anymore to stay silent. There's a milchama pnimit that's going on inside of me that I need to say this. I need to get this off my chest because these are trade secrets that the Jewish people have been holding very close to the cards, close to the chest for so long. And the time has come to reveal this to the world. And some of the things that we're going to say, the first chapter, which 𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗟, probably next week, we'll begin with. The first chapter got Rav Kook in so much trouble. The whole first chapter, at least the beginning of the first chapter, Rav Kook talks about the first step of tshuva is making sure that you exercise and you eat healthy. We stop smoking and we stop, and all these physical things. Now it's so obvious. But you imagine at the time that Rav Kook was writing in 1911 or whatever, when he was writing these ideas, and he was saying, He was saying, you know how holy it is that the Jewish people, that there are these chevra who, they don't keep Shabbos, they don't keep kosher, but they're exercising, they're becoming muscular. You know, and people are looking like, what are you, crazy? Rav Kook got in so much trouble. He wrote in one place, in the Sefer Oros, that Rav Kook said that even though, of course, it's true, that the ruach, the spirit, if you will, of the old yeshuv, meaning all the rabbis and the people who are, you know, still in the game from their great-grandparents, who have not this funny, you know, if you ever walk into someone's house, you see like there's pictures on the wall, and they have like, you know, bearded rabbi, beard gone. You know, one generation. A lot of us have this kind of like, so Rav Kook split the world into, there was the old yeshuv, those people who kind of like, they kept the bearded rabbi thing going on the whole way down the line. And that's just a very tongue-in-cheek way of saying, you know, but it's much more than the externals. And the new yeshuv, which are these people who said, you know, enough with the gullus mentality. The Jewish people have to stand up for ourselves, be strong, we have to be a nation like every other nation. And Rav Kook said, of course it's true that the people who maintained a certain fidelity to the old world way of doing things, of course their ruach, their spirit, is higher than the new yeshuv, the people who have thrown off the chains of the technicalities of religion in search for something grand and something, you know, that seemed more universal. And in doing so through a Shabbos and kashrus and all these things. Of course their ruach is greater. But it's also true that the nefesh, which means the more embodied part of the soul, the nefesh of the new yeshuv is greater than the old yeshuvs. The ruach of the old yeshuv might be greater. The ruach of those old Yidden who stayed true to Torah and were continued learning and continued steeped in the details of halachic observance, their ruach is greater. But the nefesh, the body of the Jewish people, of those people who maybe they threw off certain responsibilities, but there's what to learn from them also, that those who are maybe gedolim beruach Yisrael need to learn from the nefesh Yisrael of the others. And people just cut out that one line that said the nefesh of the Yafo soccer team is greater than the rabbis learning in Mea Sharim, and people put that on, plastered it on billboards, and Rav Kook was, you know, yeah, people went, but you have to understand that even not out of context, even in context, Rav Kook was saying, there was a milchama pnimis that was inside of him that Rav Kook said, we're moving from a place of an exiled way of looking at the world to a new way of looking at the world. And Rav Kook here, I guess this is one last word of introduction before we start to really read about this milchama pnimis. The way I think about this all the time, you know, there's a story about Rav Tzvi Hirsch 𝗔 Rav Tzvi Hirsch of 𝗔 was known as the Sar HaZohar. He was the prince of the Zohar. Already from a young age, he was renowned both within the Hasidic world and within the world of the Vilna Gaon and his students as an expert in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar, in the Kisvei Arizal. He was a remarkable genius of a person, in Nigla and Nister both. And there was a particular meeting that took place between Rav Tzvi Hirsch and the 𝗦𝗘𝗖𝗓 HaKoshen. The 𝗦𝗘𝗓 HaKoshen is one of the great Gaonim in Lamdos. You know, the Sefer of 𝗦𝗘𝗓 HaKoshen is considered, there are certain yeshivas where like, if you don't know these 10 𝗦𝗘𝗓 HaKoshens, like you're not Maritz. You need to know at least these. You know, these are like the bread and butter of Lamdos, of learning like Talmud with a fine tooth comb, specifically in monetary law. So the 𝗦𝗘𝗓 HaKoshen one time met with Rav Tzvi Hirsch 𝗔. He bumped into him and he said, tell me something. He said, you're a genius. I see you're a genius. And I know that you're part of the camp of the Baal Shem Tov and his students. So tell me, what did the Baal Shem Tov bring to the world that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who all camps, whether you're Hasidic or Misnagdic or whatever you are, Sephardic or Ashkenazic, everybody looks to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai as one of the great rabbis of all time. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and what he revealed in the Zohar HaKadosh, and the Arizal, what he did, which also no one has a problem with the Arizal. So in the mystic tradition, they already did the work. What did the Baal Shem Tov, what was like the chiddush of the Baal Shem Tov? What did he even do? So Rav Tzvi Hirsch 𝗔 said to the 𝗦𝗘𝗓 HaKoshen, he said, I'll give you a parable. He said there was once a man who came and he was telling everybody about this amazing bird that lived in this tropical island. And the thing about this bird is that it looked and sounded exactly like a human being. Its face had these very human characteristics. And it could speak, not like just a parrot or it could parrot. It could say novel, creative things. It could have an actual conversation with it, not just the things that it memorized. And people thought he was crazy. And he described this bird that he had once encountered. Came along a second fellow, and the second fellow said, I'm going to go to the island. I'm going to go see this bird for myself. And not only that, but I'm going to bring with me someone who can, an artist who will be able to, I'll bring digital dream art with me, and on a tablet we'll make a picture of the bird, and I'll make a few, voice recordings, or in the original telling of this story, and I'll write down in the notebook some of the witticisms that the bird conveys, and I'll bring it back to the people. That's what he did, and everyone said, it's interesting, but it's a little strange, this is, a bird with a human head, and it's a whole bizarre thing. Until finally there was a third person who went to the island and said, enough with this, I'm just going to go bring the bird back. I'll bring it to the people and show it to them what it is. So Rav 𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗟 said to the 𝗠𝗘𝗗𝗜𝗜 HAKOHEN, he said, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he told the whole world that there's something called the Ribbono Shel Olam. And he described the Ribbono Shel Olam and how the Ribbono Shel Olam interacts with the world through a series of pipelines, spiritual pipelines, these emanations, these divine emanations called the Spheros, and he was describing it. And it was something that was so out there that it needed to be kept as a secret doctrine, for all this time. And then the Arizal came and he said, I'm going to do a little bit more. I'm going to actually make this into like a picture that people can sink their teeth into, and I'll describe a little further, and I'll make it into something that is digestible, at least to some people. Until the Baal Shem Tov came and he said, I'm just going to bring the Ribbono Shel Olam to the world. I'm going to bring Hashem to people. I'm going to show them how this kind of out there Kabbalistic idea is in their meal that they're eating right now. It's in their business meeting that they're having. So when I think about what Rav Kook is doing here, there were people who spoke about Teshuva before Rav Kook. The Rambam wrote about Teshuva, Rabbeinu Yonah wrote about Teshuva, the Meiri wrote about Teshuva. There are books about Teshuva, the Baal Tanya wrote about Teshuva. And there are different dargas that the Jewish people underwent in going through this world of Teshuva and having it brought down to the world. And Rav Kook was saying, I'm fighting this, ani nilcha milchama pnimit. I'm fighting this inner battle. I just want to bring Teshuva to the world finally. I'm done with talking about here's how you do it, and here's the theoretical, and if you did this Aveira, then, say this 5 times and fast this number of times. I want to bring the world of Teshuva to people. Bring the bird back and have people be actually able to see it and to feel what it is to do Teshuva. But on the other hand, there's a reason why that bird was kept hidden for a long time. There's a reason why Teshuva was kind of put to the side in terms of in some of the ways that we spoke about in the previous 2 shiurim, in the way that Teshuva touches on free will, and in the way that one of the chashuvei, the ladies who joined us in the shiur came over to me after and said, but isn't this a dangerous idea? This idea that it's all good and even your mistakes are good, and isn't that a license to do that? And it's very murkav, it's very complex, and she's right. So we need to make sure that we're learning this in a way that we have a good guide. And Baruch Hashem, we have an amazing guide in Rav Kook. So this war that he's fighting, this internal war, he says, Kol ra'ayonosai rak bahem merukazim. Every waking thought, everything that I'm doing is, I learned Torah a little bit, and then I think more about Teshuva. How do we bring the world to Teshuva? And then, I'll go and Rav Kook was the chief rabbi. He had, important. And then I go and I'm metapel with some almanos and some yisomim, with some orphans and some widows, and I try to help them to get a little money, and I'm writing letters of approval for this institution or for that, and then back to Teshuva again. And everything I'm doing is just whatever stream I find myself on. It's just every single river is leading to this ocean of Teshuva. Every thought that I have is completely mirukaz, like tachana merkazi. It's centralized, right? Everything is centralized around this one thought of Teshuva. HaTeshuva hi tofeses es hachilek hayoser gadol b'Torah u'b'chaim. So this is the line that I wanted to focus on now for a few minutes, just by going through some other sources that will help us to understand this. Teshuva, says Rav Kook, just translate the words first. Teshuva is tofes hachilek hayoser gadol b'Torah u'b'chaim. If you would make a pie chart of what Torah is about and what life is about, Teshuva takes a big, if not the biggest, if not more than several of the other pieces put together, it takes a big chunk out of that pie chart in terms of what is life about. What is Torah all about? So we know that the Taryag mitzvos, the 613 mitzvos, are already from the time of the Gemara. The Gemara in Makos describes how the 613 mitzvos correspond to 613 body parts, 248 limbs, 365 different ligaments, sinews that connect the different parts of the body. And those correspond to the positive and the negative commandments. So we find already in the Rishonim, that's in the Gemara, we find this already. In the Rishonim, we already find those who had a project to try to find what are the body parts that correspond to various mitzvahs. Meaning, what exactly are the body parts that are connected to this kind of mitzvah, that. And so we have, for example, in the Sefer Charedim, the Sefer Charedim is one of the Rishonim, who enumerates the 613 mitzvahs, and he writes, Elu ha-mitzvos ha-shaychim liyad hayamin. These are the mitzvahs that correspond to the right hand. And these are the mitzvahs that correspond to the left hand. And these are the mitzvahs that correspond to the heart, and to the lips, and to the mind, and to the ears, and to the nose. And he goes through all of a Jewish person's life, and here are the different mitzvahs. And there are even people who, b'derech skula, we won't weigh in on this right now, but there are different people who b'derech skula, they have something that's wrong with their leg. So they'll learn the Sefer Charedim on that mitzvah, and they'll try to learn, like, how am I not using my leg properly, in this kind of very one-to-one correlation type of way. But in a more general sense, we see that the Gemara already has this concept. And there's an amazing, if you've never seen it before, and even if you have heard it, it's kedai to look inside every once in a while to remind yourself this is the first time I'm looking at it in a very long time. So the Mishnah Berurah, 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗜𝗓, writes in the introduction to Hilchos Shabbos that we know that the 248 mitzvos and the 365 losases, that these correspond to the different parts of the body, and therefore it makes a lot of sense that there are certain mitzvos, there just have to be, that there are certain mitzvahs, even though we don't say, like the Mishnah says in Pirkei Avos, mitzvah kala kechamura, we treat what seems like a light or insignificant mitzvah as just as meaningful and just as urgent as what seems to be a very large and weighty type of ethical and moral norm. Wearing a garment of wool and linen and murder, for example. We try to treat them equally. But using this paradigm of looking at the mitzvos as being garments for the soul, which somehow mirrors the human body, right? The human body, it mirrors the soul. The soul fills the human body in such a way that we can describe the soul in these almost body-like parts, so that we speak of the mitzvos as levushim, as coverings, as clothing for the soul, in the same way that the body needs a covering, it needs clothing. So the soul also needs these various coverings. It makes a lot of sense, by the way, I'll just parenthetically, that Adam and Chava in Gan Eden didn't need clothing. They also didn't need mitzvahs. They needed one mitzvah. That's all they needed. Don't eat from the tree. And everything was kind of within that. That one mitzvah was the overarching covering of all of the other mitzvahs. In fact, some of the other minor mitzvahs that they did have, for example, the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, which really, they're called the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach because they really begin with Noach, but 6 out of those 7 were given to Adam as well. Don't kill, don't steal, avodah zarah, these things. Chazal learn all of those out from the mitzvah not to eat from the Eitz Hadas. They learn from each of the words in that pasuk, how each word in that pasuk corresponds to a different one of those 6 out of the 7 of the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach. The only one that didn't apply yet was not to eat live animals, because Adam and Chava were forbidden from eating any meat whatsoever, dead or alive. So that wasn't necessary for them. But 6 out of the 7 are learned from this one mitzvah because it was just like one big covering over them. It was one, but we have all these different parts, all these different mitzvahs which cover the various different limbs of the human body. So says the Mishnah Berurah, listen carefully to this. He says, therefore, and he's writing this as the introduction to Hilchos Shabbos. Therefore, why am I writing this book about how a person should observe Shabbos? He said, because it stands to reason that if the 248 mitzvos correspond to different limbs in the body, and the 365 losases correspond to different parts of the connecting pieces, the ligaments that connect the different parts of the body, so then it also stands to reason that just like in the body, there are vital organs. There are certain organs which, listen, nobody wants to lose a finger, God forbid, or even a whole leg, chalila. But a person can live. A person can live. We've all seen people, a person can live without a leg, a person can live without an arm. But when a person's brain or a person's heart or a person's lungs are in danger, kidneys, there's certain parts that are more vital. So says the Chofetz Chaim, Shabbos, I don't know exactly what vital organ it is, says the Chofetz Chaim. I can't tell you one-to-one what vital organ it is. But Shabbos is like the heart of the Jewish people. It's like the brain of the Jews, the lungs of the Jews, the oxygen of the Jewish people. And so I need to write a special book. There's one whole chelek of Mishnah Berurah that all deals with Hilchos Shabbos, because in the same way you don't take chances. If you're having a little bit of a problem with one of your fingernails, so you don't have to get so many friends involved to decide like whether you're going to go to this doctor or that doctor. But if, God forbid, you're getting a stent put in, or you're having a heart surgery, you want to know that there's a person who knows what they're doing. And so when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, we're dealing with a vital organ. And vital organs are just different. So why do I bring that up? I bring that up because it's interesting to think of tshuva, as Rav Kook is going to say in a moment. Tshuva is tofeses hachilek hagadol hayoser b'chaim u'b'torah. And so I would like to suggest, and Rav Kook almost says this almost explicitly here, that for Rav Kook, in the same way that the spine of a human being is what connects all the different pieces, the brain and the heart and all the other limbs are all connected through the spine. The spine, which is the support system for the skeletal structure of the human being, in a certain sense, tshuva is like the yesod of everything. Without tshuva, we would maybe for one day try. And we would just be crushed by the weight of the obligation and the weight of our imperfection and the weight of this general project that we've been talking about, which is the project of perfecting. Tshuva is what gives us patience. Tshuva is what gives us hope. And without tshuva, we would just melt into a puddle of yeush. We would melt into a puddle of just complete giving up all hope. So, for example, we find that there are certain mitzvos that the Rambam counted in the 613 mitzvos that the Ramban thought that the Rambam was off. Just to show you one more example of this, and we'll continue in the reading. The Ramban writes that the Rambam counts as mitzvah aleph, the first of the 613 commandments is the mitzvah to believe in God. So the Ramban says, the mitzvah to believe in God is so foundational. It's so much a prerequisite to doing anything else. Yes, a person can mimic and parrot and do all these things, but the belief in God, the belief in a master of the world who not only created the world but is still involved in the world, in a certain sense, it sits at the root of all the other mitzvahs. If there is no commander, then there can be no commandments. And so for the Ramban says, strike it. Now, do we mean to say that the Ramban doesn't think that it's a positive commandment to believe in God? No, he just thinks that it's so big that it cannot be commanded. It is a prerequisite it sits at the base of everything that it means to be a Jew in the world. And, lastly, the Orot HaTeshuva, who was a contemporary of the Mishnah Berurah, the Orot HaTeshuva, in the beginning of Hilchos Tefillah, writes that there is a similar machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban about whether there's a mitzvah to daven, to pray. Is there a mitzvah to pray? So the Rambam writes unequivocally that there is a daily mitzvah to pray. A person has to daven once a day, every day. 3 times a day is a rabbinic decree that came afterwards, but every day a person has to speak to Hashem, and speaking to Hashem means some sort of acknowledgement of the grandeur, the majesty of Hashem, some sort of request, and some sort of thanks for all the things that got me to the moment where I'm able to even stand here and open my mouth. If you do those 3 things once a day, you've fulfilled the requirement of tefillah once a day. The Ramban says there is no such mitzvah. It doesn't exist. The Ramban says there's no such mitzvah. The Ramban writes, the mitzvah of davening is only specifically when a person finds themselves in a state of, like the pasuk says, if you find that you are completely attacked and surrounded on all sides by enemy armies, or there is a famine, or there is some existential threat to your existence, right? All existential threats, I guess, to your existence, right? If there is some threat to your life, then it is considered a positive commandment. But you wake up in the morning, drink your morning coffee, get on the bus or get in your car, drive to work. There's no need to daven every single day. Rav Soloveitchik has a very famous approach to this where he says that the Rambam and the Ramban essentially agree, but the Rambam thinks that the whole world is an existential crisis. Like just waking up in the morning, we're on a ball that's spinning through, the cosmos, and there's comets flying around all over the place. We're in existential crisis just by dint of the fact that we're alive. The Orot HaTeshuva gives a little bit of a different approach. He says that perhaps the machlokas between the Rambam and the Ramban is similar to the machlokas about whether or not believing in God is a mitzvah. It's not that the Ramban thinks that it's not a positive commandment to pray every day. It's that the Ramban thinks, and this is the language that he uses, and this is where I got this language of the spine. He says it's that the mitzvah, the value of tefillah is so profound. It's like the spine of all the other mitzvos. Because in the same way that emunah is at the root of, so tefillah fosters emunah. One could argue that Shabbos also fosters emunah. Shabbos is Zecher L'Maaseh Bereishis, Zecher L'Yetzias Mitzrayim. It's a reminder of the fact that Hashem created the world, and that He not only created the world, but He was involved in the poor, subjugated people who were, stuck in Mitzrayim, and He continued to have some sort of access to the affairs of what the goings-on of humanity. And so the shidra, the spine of the human being, seems to be this mashal, I guess you could even have different parts of the spine, that fits very nicely into these broader, larger type of under-foundational yisodos of what it means to be a Jew. And so for Rav Kook, tshuva is on that list. Tshuva is on the short list of the vital organs. And so therefore, Rav Kook writes, With that introduction, we'll now be able to read more smoothly what Rav Kook is going to poetically describe for us.
Is he basically saying that without it, nothing can be? Like without the
Can't
spine,
take one step.
The spine's not going to...
Can't take one step. Tonight, I was giving a shiur between Mincha and Marv in 𝗦𝗢𝗖𝗓. That was in Hebrew. And we were talking about, in a different sefer of Rav Kook, in the sefer Midos Raya, the book of where Rav Kook goes through different character traits, Ava, Emunah, Tzniut, Yira, Pachad, all these different kind of character traits. So we were talking about this notion that Rav Kook has. We'll get there because it's in Orot HaTeshuva also. Where Rav Kook talks about the notion of doing tshuva when you make the right decision. Which is, I'm saying this in response to what you said, is tshuva something which is like you can't get started without it. So Rav Kook says that you have two paths in front of you. You have two options. I mean, you always have two options, right? So there's at least two options in front of you. I'll give you an example, a perfect example. So anybody who's sitting here right now and enjoying this shiur, anybody who's watching the shiur later, is choosing to sit and to learn Torah and to think about the concept of tshuva, and therefore are not home or are not attentive to their husbands or wives, depending on which side of the mechitza I guess you're sitting on or who you are. So you're not attending to your husband or your wife or some other responsibility. And even though there's certainly a place to say that at least some of the time, choosing to engage in spiritual learning takes precedence over, let's say, folding laundry. Sometimes you can do both at the same time, modern technology. So, yes, it's true that sometimes choosing learning Torah or davening takes precedence over some other responsibility. But, says Rav Kook, and this is an amazing yisod, we'll get there eventually, Rav Kook says, don't think for a second that if you made the right decision, that is to say, all things being equal, both in terms of the 4 standard chalakim of the Shulchan Aruch and the 5th chalak of the Shulchan Aruch, which is just seichel and using your mind and making sure that this makes a lot of sense, and it's obviously in line with the Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes there's multiple ways, and sometimes it's not addressed. There's a lot of situations that are not addressed in the Shulchan Aruch. So it crosses all the, dots all the I's, crosses all the T's, you're good. And now you've decided to do this proper activity. Kook says, don't think for a second that you don't have to do tshuva for making the right decision. For making the right decision. Meaning, don't think, because if tshuva means I'm a bad person, then that makes no sense. But for Rav Kook, like we already described it, tshuva doesn't mean I'm a bad person. Tshuva means recalibration. And so if I choose, bo nagid, to walk down the street, I'll give you another example. This is an example that I gave tonight. So I teach, Baruch Hashem, I have the opportunity occasionally to teach young men, and sometimes young women, sometimes older men and older women. So in yeshiva, at the end of a long day of giving shiurim, certainly at the end of a long week of giving shiurim, it's not uncommon when I'm leaving yeshiva, the last shiur of the week, when I'm going home for Shabbos, to say good Shabbos to all the students and to give the Talmidim a hug. Even in this day and age, you have to be more careful with these types of things. But to give each of the Talmidim a hug, at least if it's someone that I know that, right? So I would never. I also teach in seminaries, to young women. Even to finish the sentence is ridiculous. So Rav Kook says, but ava ach v'shalom v'reus, love every person. You should want a certain sense of camaraderie with everybody equally. Who cares what side of the gender spectrum they're on? So Rav Kook says, of course you can give a hug to but don't think that you don't have to do tshuva every time you walk down the street, and because you're in a certain neighborhood and because there's different stadim in terms of the dinim, exactly how this applies. There's a halacha that she'elas shalom is asr for a man to a woman or a woman to a man. You can't walk down the street and give. The post can describe what is she'elas shalom. You can walk down the street and say hello to a woman in a remote. Yes. And a woman can walk down the street and she can say hello to a man in a remote. This is perfectly normal. There's a discussion in the poskim, what is she'elas shalom? She'elas shalom maybe is a formal kind of like bowing to each other, something we don't really have anymore even. But if you're in Me'esharim, and the etiquette is somewhat different. So it could be that you walk down the street and you pass someone of the opposite gender, and you don't say hello to that person. Rav Kook said, maybe that's the right thing to do. Maybe that's the right thing to do. But you also have to do tshuva for not saying hello. Because maybe if you keep not saying hello over and over and over again without recalibrating, you're going to become a person who doesn't see value. You're going to think that the reason you're not saying hello is not because tznius is such a holy thing, but because there's something ugly about the other side of something, Or a person decides to censor themselves from reading certain things or from listening to certain things. There's a whole host of things out there that a person could listen to. So a person decides, I'm going to listen to these types of podcasts, not listen to these types of podcasts. So maybe that's a holy decision, but you also have to recognize that demands a recalibration. Am I curious enough about all different areas, or am I kind of like pigeonholing myself into one particular area of study? Maybe there's a whole world out there. And even though I keep choosing correctly not to listen to certain things because it's foul for some reason or whatever, at the same time, I recalibrate towards, so this is the world of tshuva that Rav Kook. So you ask the question, this is a long answer to your question, but you ask the question, is this, you need tshuva because you can't get started without it? It's like, yeah, because even if you make the right decisions, you need tshuva. Because tshuva doesn't mean I'm bad. Tshuva means I need constant recalibration towards the tachlis, which is perfection, which is not something that comes easy in the world. And that's where Rav Kook is going to get at the end of this introduction. He's going to say, nobody has ever done tshuva fully in this world yet. Not even one person. So let's read inside a little bit more.
It's important to try and know what perfection is then.
Yes.
It's unreachable.
Yes. It's an unreachable thing that we're striving towards. And when we get into a proper upward swing, then what happens is we move ever closer toward it, so that every moment is a step closer, and therefore there's the elation of kind of progress without that funny step that we sometimes have when progress doesn't happen, or it happens sporadically, where we'll have, you ever think about it like that? I was talking to a good friend of mine, very talented person, really putting his eggs in the right baskets, really investing himself in good things. And he was having like a hard day, He's like, I have this project and that project, and all these things, and they're all coming along to fruition. But, when you judge yourself by productivity, whatever it is, spiritual productivity, material productivity, so then it's never fast enough, Then getting the next thing out and the high and the bump of, finishing a project before the next one comes to a head. So tshuva is this process, it's like walking, it's a talich of like similar to walking, where while one leg is coming down, the other one is coming up. And it's learning to walk in a certain way it's what Rabbi Nachman described as, based on earlier svarim, as rutzav v'shov, this constant running and returning, the way that the malachim are described in the vision of Yechezkel and the Ma'aseh Merkava, the loftiest Kabbalistic idea. The malachim are running towards Hashem and then returning, recoiling. In fact, tefillah itself, The whole notion, according to some, of what it is that when we shuckle, when we daven, Jewish people, they sway when they daven, when they pray. Why do we sway when we daven? Because there's this engagement and realizing that I have a lot more to do, and engagement, and then coming backwards and recognizing that I'm not there yet. And when you get into that kind of sway, that meditative sway, you don't get stuck in the step down. It's in the same way that when you're climbing a ladder, to use another muscle, when you're climbing a ladder and you push your foot down, you are indeed putting pressure down, but you are climbing up simultaneously. Even in the moment that you're pushing down, you're climbing up. And so that dance of imperfection towards perfection, imperfection towards perfection, is this beautiful, very complex thing that the Sefer kind of describes. Okay, so it's tofes zachilik hayoser gadol b'torah b'chaim aleh b'nuya kol ha'tikva ha'ishios v'hatziborios. So now I'll move a little bit faster. Upon Teshuva is built all of the hopes of both ishiot, of both individual people, and tziborios, also communities. Communities need Teshuva because people make mistakes and need recalibration in communities. Wouldn't you believe it? Hi mitzvahs Hashem she mitzad echad kala shebekalas. On the one hand, Teshuva is a mitzvah which is the easiest of the easiest things to do. All it is just a change of heart. So much so that the Gemara says in Maseches Kedushin, a very famous, celebrated Gemara, that even if a Rasha Gamur, a person whose whole life is steeped in making the wrong decisions, walks over to a young lady and says, "You are hereby betrothed to me, Hareat Mekudeshesli, b'tabatzu al menas, that I am a tzaddik Gamur." So the Gemara says the Kiddushin is valid, even though it was al tanai. There was some sort of small script on the bottom that said, "If I'm a tzaddik Gamur," right? Because the Gemara says, because maybe he had like an about face, maybe he had a turnabout, and in that moment of that turnabout, so then he was a tzaddik Gamur. So on the one hand, kal shebekalos. On the other hand, says Rav Kook, Sharei hirur tshuva hu kvar tshuva. One thought of tshuva is already tshuva. Umitzad echad harei kasha shebekashos shelo yatsa adayin elapol b'milua ba'olam u'chayim. Because no one in the history of the world has ever fully actualized the power of tshuva. If it were true, then let me ask you a question. Adam Harishon ate from the Eitz Hadas, and we mentioned it a few weeks ago in the Shiur. Afterwards, he ran into Cain, and he said, knew what happened. Cain said, I did tshuva. Adam said, wow, you did tshuva. I never realized tshuva was such a powerful thing. This is more Shir Yom HaShabbos. Shabbos not from the Lashon of Shabbos, like we were saying Mishnah Berurah before. Shabbos, the Lashon of Lashuv, of tshuva. So Adam did tshuva. The Gemara says Adam brought karbonos. Adam, engaged in a bunch of fasting. Adam Rishon immersed himself in all types of rivers in order to perfect himself, in order to attain tshuva. So why wasn't he?
Why wasn't that it?
Yeah, why didn't he go back into Gan Eden? Why wasn't that the end of the story?
Still that question.
Right? The answer is because there's many, many different levels to tshuva. Because tshuva on the one hand is kal shebekalos. A hirur tshuva is already tshuva. On the other hand, tshuva is this full integration, this full synthesis of this sefer and more, in learning how to walk this walk of Ratzah V'Shov, this meditative sway of forwards and backwards, almost at the same time, almost at the exact same time. That is happening with such rapid succession that it's almost like it's happening at the same time. And so the growth and the recognition that I am not yet there, the not yet there-ness, as well as the pushing forward, work in tandem, are a catalyst to one another. That's really what we're waiting for, and that has not come to actualization. Rav Kook is going to try to help us to understand how we do that. A few more minutes. I find myself constantly thinking about tshuva and nothing else. A lot has already been written. Like I told you before, the mashal of Rav 𝗦𝗘𝗗𝗜𝗔𝗟. Right? Somebody already described this bird. Somebody already took pictures of the bird. Somebody already, showed us some of the witticisms that this bird has produced. This majestic bird of tshuva. It's already been described. A lot's been written. Torah, Nevi'im, Divrei Chachamim. But we still have people who think of tshuva as this heavy, dark, self-flagellating thing where a person just looks at tshuva with all the wrong eyes. Hasafrut, literature, Hamishotetes b'chol zavios sheish bo Shiur v'chaim. Literature, and this is so beautiful, Rav Kook writes, literature which has its way of seeping into every crack and every nook and cranny of any place where there is song and life. There's a book about it. There's people are writing poetry about it. There's art that's suffused with, these various different things. Wherever there's song, wherever there's life, wherever there's vitality in the world, there's literature is interested in trying. Human beings want to describe and to capture this in language. Lo chadra klal letoch 𝗦𝗢𝗔𝗟 HaChaim HaNifla hazeh. When it comes to tshuva, that great world of literature, of the arts, which descend and ascend into every area, every nook and cranny of life and so on, lo chadra, they have not begun to dig even the slightest bit into this 𝗦𝗢𝗟 HaChaim HaNifla hazeh, into this treasure house of life, this wondrous treasure house of life, 𝗦𝗢𝗟 HaTeshuva, this treasure house of tshuva. Forget about writing it. They haven't even become interested in it. It's not even like, after I write about this, and this, I'd like to get to that. It's not even there's no desire to even do it. Ladas es tchunaso v'arko, to learn to understand what is its nature, what is its value. Afilu mitzido hapiuti, even in poetry. Right? What the nature of poetry? Why are people interested in poetry? Because poetry takes the ineffable and starts to make it effable, makes it something that a person, it gives verbiage, gives language to that which is impossible to describe. By somehow mixing up the order and making it somewhat spoken in this twisted, threaded sort of form, I acknowledge the fact that I really can't say this properly, so I will say it in a way which is not saying it in this roundabout kind of way. So even if you want to say that tshuva is so high that maybe people aren't even in it, there's no poetry about tshuva. Rav Kook at the back, in the end of Orot HaTeshuva, has a few poems, a few songs that he wrote about tshuva. It's the beginning. He's trying to... And Rav Kook is writing this not only because he's upset about it in this theoretical, but because Rav Kook was surrounded by people who the status quo establishment rabbinate had already written off as having left the path. These super talented people whose names grace a lot of the streets when we walk the streets, and we see Chernikovsky and Brenner and all of these street names that we see throughout Yerushalayim, were these unbelievable writers and poets, these people who went to yeshiva and were given the same old, dry, not illuminated Judaism that robbed them of something Rav Kook writes about in Orot HaTorah, about the din v'cheshbon that certain people are going to have to give because they lost out on these unbelievable souls, these huge souls. And from those who were the students of Rav Kook, who did have the proper education, we can understand what we missed out on those who didn't have this. And so Rav Kook here is also pleading with the artists and the writers of his generation, saying, Chaver, come, let me show you this. And they were a little nervous of Rav Kook. Rav Kook made them a little uneasy. And maybe we may not finish it. We might spend maybe 10 minutes at the beginning next time, and we'll jump into the Sefer. But
why? Because it was non-conformity.
Rav Kook made them a little nervous because Rav Kook was he was this charismatic figure that just washed over them because he was so loving and he was so open and yet so staunch and so rooted, and was an expert in philosophy and art. And Rav Kook describes how when he was stuck in the interim in World War I, when he was stuck in London, he was stuck in Switzerland, so he went to go look at some of the art of Rembrandt, and described how he felt that if Rembrandt would have had the proper tutoring, and this is about a non-Jew, this also got Rav Kook in trouble, he could have been a prophet, Rembrandt, because he saw the way that he was able to see the world and capture it. He had this prophetic ability. Yeah, he had this eye to him that. And Rav Kook saw that, and that's by someone who wasn't from the from the tribes, and so for those people who were in Rav Kook's company, who Rav Kook was desperately trying to show them this way of illumination, and to throw off the chains of exile that are giving them a version of Judaism which is choking them, like the mashal that we sometimes describe. It's in a few different. I originally heard it from 𝗠𝗘𝗗𝗜𝗔. I just recently heard it from Rav Kook also. Like a child, when they reach the age of 3, some people have the custom of getting a haircut, upsharon, and the child puts on tzitzis for the first time. So imagine that some people are wearing the same tzitzis when they're 3 as when they're 6, as when they're 7, 8, 9, 10, 20, 30, 40 years old. They're still wearing the same pair of tzitzis. It would be choking them around the neck, if they're wearing the same pair of tzitzis. But when it comes to theology, or the way we relate to prayer, or to divinity, or to Torah, we're wearing the same tzitzis we were wearing since we were 3 years old. Completely immature, unsophisticated, hasn't progressed, and there's a world of literature out there that can help us to progress. And for us, Rav Kook is saying we're still holding on to a version of tshuva which is not since we were 3 years old, but this is thousands of years old still, this level of tshuva. Our books of tshuva from the Rambam and Rabbeinu Yonah, and that's not thousands of years, that's 400 years old.
He still sees value in it, though, right?
Of course, because everything that he's writing is rooted in that. But Rav Kook is saying we need to, in the same way that the 3-year-old tzitzis are identical in many ways, and almost always, to the adult tzitzis. It has the same strings, and maybe they're slightly longer or bigger. Maybe the material is slightly augmented. Maybe there's some differences in size, but the form it's the same concept. And so Rav Kook is taking this, which is why it's a beautiful mashal. He's taking the same material and he's processing it through an update in 2,000 years for Rav Kook, what he sees as human evolution in a positive vein that also came with a lot of things that needs recalibration. So let's end with this. We'll just finish this paragraph, and we'll take 10 minutes at the end, at the beginning next time, before we jump into chapter 1. So Rav Kook says, I want to present and I want to know deeply all these different areas of literature, whether it's poetry or prose, which has the ability to enhearten a person, to wake up the heart. All the more so, nobody's written a book. That is, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, we broke last week, we didn't have Shiur, but 2 weeks ago I mentioned, Rav Kook said, I want this to be a practical guide. I want people to know what is step 1, what is step 2, what do we do? So kal v'chomer, people aren't interested in the theoretical, poetic kind of underpinnings of tshuva. All the more so, nobody's been putting a finger onto the pulse to sort of feel the chelek ha'ma'asi, what needs to be done. And all the more so, our new life here, that we have never tasted before, here in a land where we have, at least in Rav Kook's vision, we're coming close, he didn't ever live to see it, to a land where the Jewish people have some sort of self-sovereignty, and where we're able to build batei medrash and schools for children that could be built on these yisodos, that there could be curricula built. We never had this before. We always had people telling us what we have to study and what we have to teach our children. But now we have, for the first time, the opportunity to give this medicine to our children and to build our communities around these ideas, and nobody's doing anything about it. So in the last little piece, Rav Kook says, I'm going to do it, but I'm terrified to do it, terrified to death of it. Because who am I, says Rav Kook, who am I to pick up this, this torch, to pick up this banner and to wave it around? It's something which is a big task, but something which, as I told you from the beginning of the Shiur, for Rav Kook, it wasn't about having the strength to say. But at this point, it was weighing so heavy on him. He was watching his brothers and sisters just drop like flies when there's medicine sitting right there to show them the ore of tshuva, the light of tshuva, because for them it was all darkness. Or not all darkness, but for many people it was very heavy. And so for Rav Kook said, I don't anymore have the strength to remain silent. And Mirz Hashem, next week, we'll continue to hear the voice of Rav Kook shouting throughout the land in his sweet and gentle way.